All right, so in this teaching today, we're going to be going over the extra biblical evidence for Jesus living. How do we know that Jesus actually walked the earth? Is it just because the Bible tells us that he lived, or is there evidence outside of the Bible, extra biblical, that proves that Jesus walked the earth? The answer, yes, there is. Okay, so what I'm going to go over are 6 non-Christian ancient sources that talk about this person named Jesus or Christ who walked the earth. Now, this, of course, doesn't prove that Jesus rose from the dead. Those can be determined with other proofs. However, this does at least get you to the point where you can't say that he was just made up, or that he's like, some people try to say, oh, he's like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. No, this was an actual historical person, and we will give you evidence to the non-Christian sources that he did walk the earth. So let's get into it. So these 6 sources, we have what's called a mnemonic to help you remember them. A mnemonic is similar to when you're learning how to play music, right? Every good boy deserves fudge. E, G, B, D, F. Okay? So that'll help you to remember that. Well, this mnemonic is, my pastor believes that Jesus lived. Okay? My pastor believed that Jesus lived. So we have 6 letters there, and each one of those letters is going to represent a different non-Christian source. So let's get into the first one, M. M is for Mara bar Serapion. In a passage written sometime between AD 73 and AD 200, Mara bar Serapion, who was a Stoic philosopher from the Roman province of Syria, made these casual remarks about Jesus. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, lived in complete dispersion. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teachings which he had given. So here early on, we have an ancient non-Christian source or reference to Jesus, who is the Jewish wise king, being executed. Okay, let's go to the second source, which again, our acronym is, my pastor believes that Jesus lived. P for pastor brings us to our second source, Pliny the Younger. I got to read this. Pliny the Younger's real name is Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus. That was a hard name for a teacher to repeat as he was growing up, I bet. He had letters to Emperor Trajan, who was the emperor in Rome at that time. Now, Pliny the Younger lived from AD 61 to AD 113, and he was the Roman governor of Bithynia. And we have letters of his that he wrote to Emperor Trajan. Emperor Trajan was the Roman emperor from AD 98 to 113. Now, in Pliny's letter to Emperor Trajan, written somewhere in between AD 109 and AD 111, Pliny relates some of the information that he has learned about these Christians. Here's what he says. They were on the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang, in alternate verses, a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to create any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then to reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So this passage is interesting for many reasons and provides us with important insights into the early Christians and them singing hymns and meeting together to eat. But I think most importantly, it shows us that they were worshiping Jesus as a God, okay? As God. So this was not something that was put in later by people who just wanted to make it, some people say that, oh, well, Christians never actually believed that Jesus was God. That was just put in later. Well, here we have ancient early writings, non-Christian. Of course, we have our own Christian writings that show this, but non-Christian writings that show that they were worshiping Christ as to a God. That moves us to our third non-Christian source. My pastor believes that Jesus lived. Believes is B for the Babylonian Talmud. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is a collection of early Jewish rabbinical writings. And the earliest part was compiled somewhere between AD 70 and AD 200. And it has a few references to Jesus in it. On the eve of Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald cried, quote, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and has enticed Israel to apostasy." Now you might notice Yeshu, okay, Yeshu or Yeshua is how Jesus' name is pronounced in Hebrew, so that is referring to Jesus. But what does this passage mean about saying that Jesus was hanged? Wasn't he crucified? Well, as we'll show here, hanged can be another way to describe crucifixion. For instance, Galatians 3:13 declares that Jesus was hanged or hung, and Luke 23:39 applies this term to the criminals who were crucified with Jesus. Galatians 3:13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. And then in Luke 23:39, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is, of course, an unsympathetic witness attesting that Jesus walked in power. But Jesus' sorcery was not a couple of magic tricks. He was healing the blind, casting out demons, and raising the dead. They do not deny that he performed miracles. They only disagree with the source of his power. The Talmud also declares that Jesus was crucified on the eve of Passover, just as the Bible tells us. Okay, the next letter in our mnemonic, my pastor believes that Jesus lived, is T. And that T stands for Tacitus. Publius Cornelius Tacitus, better known simply as Tacitus, was a Roman historian who lived from around AD 56 to about AD 120. Now, Tacitus wrote a book called Annals in AD 116. In one part of the book, Tacitus reports on the 6-day Great Fire of Rome that burned much of the city in AD 64 during the reign of Nero. Now, Emperor Nero was the Roman emperor from AD 54 to AD 68, and he actually blamed Christians for the fire that destroyed Rome in AD 64. Here's what he says. Nero fastened the guilt on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And a most mysterious superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in Rome. Now notice first of all that Tacitus explains that Christians derived their name from an historical person named Christus, which is Latin for Christ. Now this Christus is said to have suffered the extreme penalty, obviously referring to the Roman method of execution known as crucifixion. So this is evidence outside of the Bible from an unsympathetic witness that there was a man named Jesus who was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius in the 1st century AD, which clearly supports what the Bible has said. Okay, our fifth letter in the mnemonic, my pastor believes that Jesus lived, is the letter J, and that is represented by Josephus, or Flavius Josephus, who lived from AD 37 to AD 100 and was a Jewish historian. Now, in one of the passages he wrote from Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus described the death of John the Baptist. In another, he mentioned the execution of James, the brother of Jesus. And in the third passage, he described Jesus as a wise man. He also mentioned that Pontius Pilate condemned Jesus to be crucified. Again, just as the Bible says. And for our sixth and final letter in our mnemonic, my pastor believes that Jesus lived, we have L, which is going to be for Lucian of Samosata. Now, Lucian of Samosata was a 2nd century Greek satirist, and in one of his works, he describes Christians as such. The Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished patronage, who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted, and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. Now, although Lucian does not mention Jesus by name, this is another ancient work that is clearly referring to him. According to Lucian, he taught that all men are brothers from the moment of their conversion. Now, since they denied their other Greek gods in order to worship Jesus, it is clear that they regarded him as greater than any of the gods that Greece had to offer. And it's not too hard to see how someone would want to kill him for that. So let's sum up. What would we know about Jesus if there was no Bible, just from these non-Christian sources? First, Lucian of Samosata indicates that he was wise. This is also supported by Josephus. Second, Pliny the Younger, the Babylonian Talmud, and Lucian all declare that Jesus was a powerful and revered teacher. Third, the Babylonian Talmud indicated that he performed miraculous feats. Fourth, Tacitus, the Babylonian Talmud, Lucian, and Josephus all record that Jesus was crucified. Tacitus and Josephus record that this was under Pontius Pilate, and the Babylonian Talmud records that it was on the eve of Passover, just as the Bible talks about. So again, those are 6 non-Christian sources that record evidence for this person, Jesus of Nazareth, living in the 1st century AD, dying by crucifixion at the hands of Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. So very exciting stuff. Of course, the Bible is a reliable source in its own right, and we will go over its reliability in future videos. But just to know that even if we didn't have the Bible, we would still know this much about Jesus is really cool. If you want further resources, I would recommend the book by J. Ed Komashevsky and Robert Bowman called Putting Jesus in His Place, as well as The Evidence for the Historical Jesus by Dr. Gary Habermas. That's all for today. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson.